I was born into a family of 8 children, and we were on the Chestnut Grove plantation. It was about 500 acres, and my father was a clerk, and my mother did most of the plantation work, organizing and so forth, and that really gave me such a foundation of learning how to do business, because I was going to be needing it later on. Well, I had also 8 siblings, and I was the oldest, so that also taught me a little diplomacy as well. And so with the needlepoint and horseback riding and the fineries, I was so grateful that my mother taught me not learn to read and write, and we were taught the housekeeping and so many things. I was so grateful for this upbringing. That the Burgess house was often a place where we had different houses. My grandfather was in the Burgess house, and so we would have gatherings and so forth. And at one gathering at another plantation, I met Daniel Custis. He was almost 20 years older than myself, but he seemed much younger. You see, he had proposed to a couple of girls before myself, but his father was irascibly determined that he would never be married, because they owned 17,500 acres of land. They were the most wealthy of the Virginia colony, Daniel Custis, and his father was John. And he refused for Daniel to ever be married. So it was that when we met, I took it upon myself, and upon Providence's help, I persuaded John to let us marry. And Daniel and I were married, and we lived in the house that was called the White House. And so we were married in wonderful 7 years. My father-in-law, he passed away just before we married, and he made a will out that was going to plague me the rest of my life, 50 more years, as it was very hard to cause this will to come to pass and fulfill all the things that was in it. But he did pass just before we married, and we were married 7 years with 4 children, but my first 2 children passed away. And so when Daniel came of the fever, I had 2 little toddler children, and he passed away too. And yes, in fact, I did inherit 17,500 acres of land of this plantation. And I immediately, I had to step up quickly to be able to run the plantation and do the trading with the tobacco and the so forth that was happening. And so, of course, my being a wealthy widow, I had many suitors. 2 years passed, and again, as I said, we did entertainment, and we met one another and found out the things that were happening in the colonies through the Burgess house, or just through formal or informal gatherings in our different homes. So 2 years later, the Chamberlains had asked me to come and for me to be able to enjoy a dining time with their friends. And as the time got a little bit later, I was ready to leave. My carriage was waiting, and they said, well, just wait a little bit longer. And so they persuaded me to wait just a little bit longer. And as I did, it turns out that I think they were maneuvering a little, someone was coming up the road on his way to Williamsburg, and they wanted him to come in and join the party, so to speak. And by the time he got there, most people were gone. And when he walked in the door, 6'2", George Washington. Well, I had seen him only in the passing. We'd never spoken before, but we knew immediately if this was a setup. But we began to talk, and we had so much in common. We talked much further into the night than I was planning on coming. And finally, into the night, I would say, George, we have so much to continue to speak about, but it is getting quite late and my carriage is waiting, so if you would like to return at some point and we can continue conversation, that would be pleasing to me. And so we went home, and I went back to my White House, and he went to the place that he had just inherited. Well, actually, he was leasing it. His sister was getting married and taking all her belongings with him, and he was going to go back to that place, and that happened to be the Mount Vernon. And so he came back 2 weeks later. It's not 2 months. I was thinking it might be about 2 months, but 2 weeks later, he was back. And as you know, we married. Long story short, because there's so much to say, I will continue to say that we married, and we were married at the White House where I lived and with my 2 children. And George, was preparing the Mount Vernon for me, but he had very little furnishings because his sister had taken most of them with her getting married and moving on. And so I gathered as much as I could, wagon loads, and it took us 2 weeks to travel from the White House to Mount Vernon. And when I got there, it was a glorious sight to see the Potomac stretching out in front of the Mount Vernon. Many nights, George and I sat there and enjoyed ourselves watching the Potomac. And it was that those years were probably our best years. 15 years, we were nearly a honeymoon, I would say. My children were growing up, and my little girl, she began to have seizures, but we did all we could. And 15 years, he was the best farmer in the whole colony, I'm sure. He taught many people farming techniques that others didn't have, and he even built a 16-side barn where on the second level, the slats were open, and the horses would walk around and break the wheat or the grain down, and it would sift down to the bottom, and then it would go to the grist mill and so forth. We had quite a wonderful business going, and farm. George would have preferred to stay as a farmer, as if it were all possible, but he was involved with the Burgess House, and there was much pressure that was beginning to form from the British, and he was very well known from the French and Indian War, and so it was that he began to have a lot of decision making when they would gather at their meetings. And I'm going to get a little glass of water here. So I appreciate water that is off the tap. This is a very unusual thing. I've never heard of it before. So 15 years later, it was about 1765, and when that Stamp Act happened, and when it was beginning to be intolerable that we were being pressured to pay taxes for things that we didn't need or order or ask for. And the Stamp Act was, we were being treated as slaves. In fact, 5 years later, George decreed that, or put the word out that there would be a boycott to anything coming overseas from England. But again, just 2 years later than that was the Boston Massacre. It was, as I said, becoming intolerable. And then the Boston Tea Party. There was quartering. There was much hardship and suffering, and my daughter herself was still having the seizures, and in the year of the Boston Tea Party, she passed away. So I lost 3 children, but I still had my son, and they were getting quite old at this point, and now that the war was looking upon us. And in fact, it was that 1775, George walked into the Burgess House in his full regalia, and they knew that the war was imminent and war was upon us. And when 1775 happened, we had already known my friend that is visiting us today, and I'm so grateful that my friend has been able to come up here today, Robert Morris. In fact, we met Robert at the Stamp Act, and he began helping in financing things that we needed at that time. Robert, would you come up and talk to us a little bit about this? Now that the Revolutionary War is beginning in 1775. Thank you.
Good day. Good to see you.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to How is
Good
Molly?
morning, ladies.
Yeah, we
and
were
gentlemen.
very good friends with Molly and Robert. How is Molly?
Molly is doing awesome.
Oh,
She
so,
thinks of you often
well,
and writes.
she was such a good friend, and she did so much in hospitality too.
Yes.
But we were talking, as you heard, 1775, we were starting the war in Lexington and Concord.
Yes.
Oh, tell us about that, what happening crossing the Delaware.
Oh, the miracle at the Delaware. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a miracle.
Well, we were nearly
Washington
losing.
had been forced out of New York by the British. It was December 1775. It was a very cold winter, and he was with his army in the wilderness, and he needed a victory. And so he came up with a plan and presented it to his commanders, and I heard about this. He said, Christmas Day, the Hessians, which were on the other side of the Delaware River in Trenton, are going to be having a big party and drinking. And we could slip in that night, cross the river, and surprise them the next morning and take the town and their fort and capture a lot of their men. Now, some of the commanders are saying, General, the Delaware River is extremely cold, and it has lots of ice.
Ice and chunks
And
of
you're
ice.
crossing at nighttime. They have sentries out. They could spot us.
Yes, I was.
And that
afraid
was the
for her.
miracle. That was the miracle. As the men were getting into the boats preparing to cross, the fog came in.
The
And
fog. They never had
Awesome.
fog at that time of the year.
Awesome. And so the next morning, when the troops were in position, they attacked the Hessians and took them totally by surprise. It was all over in 20 minutes, and General Washington only lost one man.
It was such an encouragement because they were very discouraged, through the Lexington and Concord battles. And then we proceeded to have the war continue, didn't we? And I would make foods and prepare canning things and so forth, and dried goods and whatever I could throughout the summer. And then in the winter, I would come down to the encampments and help to run the encampments. You know, near Valley Forge was nearly 12,000 men, and there were 400 women and children. So the men were just begging me to come, but my George was, of course, a forlorn man without me as well. They seemed to think that I was a well-organized woman. And I helped to organize these 400 women and children and help them in their need, doing those needlework or whatever, those patching the wounded, and well, there was sickness and there was cold and freezing, and it was a grueling time. And so we did all we could to help make the men's spirits a little bit higher and a little more happier. In fact, I felt as though it was my disposition that counted more than what the circumstances, if I were to remain in a happy countenance. And I was. I did my best.
Mrs. Washington, the audience needs to know that George needed you there in Valley Forge and the other winter camps, and so did the men. It encouraged them to see you and all the other wives out there suffering, and just like they were in the cold, and they were they were so excited to see you. In fact, they gave you a nickname called
I felt a little bit modest about that, but
Mother Dragoon.
yes, the military nurse, yes, or Lady Washington, they would call me, and Mother Dragoon.
I visited George several times in the camps because I helped, finance a lot of the stuff that he needed to continue the war for ammunition and cannons and guns and food.
We would not have made
And
it.
he told me that he's so glad that you and all these women were here to help his men because it increased morale.
They needed the morale boost. Well, and when the French joined, why, one of the officers' ladies and myself, Nathaniel, his wife, we danced half the night our way when the French joined us. It was such a wonderful time that we finally had this much support, much more support when the French joined us. Well, yeah, they've called me the preambulating lady as well. I would go to all these encampments for these years. And finally, well, 1781 was the Yorktown time. And, well, my son, by now he had been married, he had children, they were living at that White House and not at Mount Vernon. So, well, he decided he wanted to go to war, so he met with the fever and passed away before he even went into Yorktown. But, Mr. Morris, you, Molly,
Yes, ma'am.
gave us the best, well, I helped her, banquet with all the officers there just before Yorktown. Molly and everyone gave, well, the war would not have been won without your advice. I believe it was possibly at this banquet that you and George had that conversation where George wanted to have a certain, he had some plans made of, would you, refresh my memory.
Mrs. Washington, it was Providence that guided me.
Providence, well,
I was
great.
not a military
All the time.
commander, but George had his commanders lay out a plan that he was going to strike the British in New York because they were weak there.
Yes,
I
that was the
thought-
plan.
I told George, the general, I said, General, you might achieve a victory, but it'll be short gained.
I remember.
You need to go after Cornwallis. He's been tearing up the South. And I suggest that you move south towards Virginia at Yorktown. And his response was, how can I get my men and my equipment down there? I don't have
He
enough.
didn't have enough supplies.
And I told him, I got it. And he listened to me.
He did, he changed his plan.
And when he arrived with his army at D.C., Washington, D.C., ready to go into Virginia, there he saw I had gotten 1.5 miles of wagons loaded with guns, cannons, powder, food,
We
and
were
every
truly
supply.
rejoicing. It was amazing.
And it was then that he with his army was able to encircle Cornwallis along with the French fleet and force the
And it
British
was
to
won.
surrender.
And the battle was won. Oh, that was the most amazing thing to see this happen. And all these supplies, thank you again. Without your funding the war, I don't think we would have won it, let alone you helped him in his planning of the war. Thank you, Robert. Well, now, there's a great parade in New York, you see, because of the war has been won. And the great parade, well, even the Cuban governor came up, and there's cannon shots and so forth, and marching down. I did not feel so well. I had a little bit of that gallbladder thing. So, but I stayed in New York for a while, but no, George had to tie up more ends of the colonies and things that were happening. I went back to Mount Vernon when I was finally feeling well enough. And, well, the years went into our freedom. However, the colonies all had different plans for themselves and their waterways and their monies, and they weren't working together very well. And George found himself more and more into meetings and calling, instead of being at the Mount Vernon where we were so grateful and finally that we were going to be able to live once again in our farming time. But he was always back and forth or doing some surveying and doing that. Well, finally it came in 1787. They decided they did need a constitution. And again, here, Robert, did you not sign the Constitution with James Madison?
I was honored to both sign not only the Constitution of the United States, but the Declaration of Independence, and even the other one that didn't work, the Articles of Confederation. I was only one of 3 individuals. that signed.
Declaration of Independence, that's right, you were there
Yes.
in 1776, yes.
Because The general needed me.
You know, I did not get to make it to that signing. They were having the smallpox out there, and then George would have got inoculated. I wasn't happy about that. So my son. So, but anyway, you signed the declaration, and I was quarantined. I had to stay outside the city for a while because of the smallpox. But thank you. You were the signer. And the Constitution now, with James Madison, now, James wasn't married to Dolly yet. She was quite a woman. She was wonderful with hospitality herself. But another year goes by, and well, it's decided we need a president. And so the papers went all through all the colonies. It took months to get back, 2-3 months. Finally, all the votes came back, and they were unanimous. George, the only president to be voted in unanimously. And I was not particularly happy about it, but this is my job, this is where my life is going to be, and I will support my husband in whatever way I can. We were very much in love with one another, and I wanted to support him any which way I could. He was in New York when he was inaugurated, and I was in Mount Vernon. And so within a couple of months, I took my entourage of people and wagons and so forth, and we went our way up to the Delaware River. And there was some fanfare along the way I was a little bit embarrassed about, but George was now president, and so that would make me, they called me Lady Washington. I understand later on with Dolly, they started the term First Lady. But we arrived at the Delaware, and they were the 13-gun salute across the way, and we rode the barge over, and then that means that I am now the president's wife. So I will take my apron off and become the president's wife, and I would order things from France. Thank you. I enjoyed the simpler things, although they were very nice. And that night after his inauguration, thank you, Mr. Morris. That night after, we had a special dinner. We didn't have a very fancy dinner, like some the papers were trying to report different ways. But we were very simple. We didn't even have a toast that night. However, he began being his presidency in New York, and so much goes on in all of these happenings. But a year and a half later, we decided we would like to move down to more of a center of where the colonies were. And so we went to Philadelphia. And Robert Morris had 7 houses, and he gave us one of his houses. We lived in that house for the 8 years that George was president. It was closest to the Independence Hall. And much goes on. A lot of loud voices, so to speak, in our house, where we would have meetings, and they would come and go, and Thomas or Alexander, the various ones that were talking about how to run the country and how to cause the Constitution to be effective. And so the years went by, and he was reelected again, as you know, but he would not be king. And there was some talk about him wanting to be a king. No, he wanted the people to have their say so. And so when the 8 years was up, and finally the 8 years was up, and my children had gone once in a while, when people were having meetings in our home, the children would go to friends or my family members or so forth. And so finally the 8 years were up in 1797, and we retired to Mount Vernon. So happy to be back to Mount Vernon. I always had people there. I had, whether it was nieces, nephews, all types of friends, people would come. We'd have gatherings on Thursdays and on Saturdays or Fridays or Saturdays at different times. 2 years into this time, George loved going out horseback riding or fox hunting, and he was out one evening when we were having guests coming over, so it started raining, and he was completely soaked and came in very wet, but all of our guests had arrived, and he did not change clothes. And by the time he went to bed that night, he had a sore throat. So that continued to progress, and I was by his side for those 6 weeks to 2 months. That's my George passed away. So I have outlived 2 husbands and 4 children. I did not go to his funeral. I did have to continue to maintain it had become in disarray quite a bit when we came back from the Revolutionary War and Mount Vernon. And so we were always doing something in repairs and need and so forth, and I was overseeing that still. But within a couple of years of that, I had the letters that George and I had written to each other, and I burned them. I didn't want everyone knowing all of our correspondence. I suppose there's 1 or 2 lines left of his affection towards me. But 2 years after he passed, I passed as well. And so that's the story of my life as Martha Washington. And perhaps there'd be any questions have come to mind or anything as we've been talking.
We went through Mount Vernon when we were back in Washington DC, and I never could get over the vibrant colors of the rooms in Mount Vernon. Now I understand they keep them pretty much like they were when you were there.
Solid
'Cause
green,
it's just such
solid.
bright
Yes.
colors.
Yeah.
And you're right, the river right behind it is just so peaceful.
It's beautiful.
It's awesome.
Yes.
And I was there, when I was in high school, and in Drummond Bureau, we once stayed, went to Washington DC and performed
You
there.
never forget.
Yes, no,
No.
never ever. I was so impressed, and I just wanted to look at the Potomac River.
And they have people in each room that'll tell you about their
Oh, they
job
did.
and what they
told
did.
us- Yes, they
for
told us all the stories.
us. Thank you.